course, when Barbara and Yari started looking at ESM in engagement, and then we had another group that was explicitly interested in the study of flow, which is, I've always been interested and fascinated by the concept of group flow. Can you get individuals to function together at this high performance edge of performance competencies as groups, the way people can function in a zone. And a good example would be an orchestra or a symphony, where everyone, all the performers lose a sense of time and something magical is going on. So that was sort of an entree for me, but I felt that a lot of the constructs, by the way, I figure I'm 90 seconds into my 5 minutes, so that's my timekeeping, 4 minutes. I thought that there wasn't a lot of good theory, and that, first of all, in my field in mathematics, if everything centered around being engaged. If I could get kids to engage in mathematics, it didn't matter where I came from on the philosophical spectrum. What was more important than the philosophical spectrum is what was going on in kids' heads. And if you could find some conditions for them to get deeply immersed in it, then the math was going to take care of itself. In a sense, that's a constructivist point of view, but that was less important to me than getting kids so that they were so wrapped up in groups or individually in manipulating mathematical objects. So you look at what people have done in engagement, though, as a study, and it was pretty pedestrian in terms of, and that's how you get into a field, how a field starts. You have to break apart the pieces, you have to differentiate the big mass, and then you can start to reintegrate something more meaningful. But to say that you're behaviorally or procedurally or conceptually or affectively engaged in something, even if you have each of those at 2 or 3 levels, you're talking about 10 to 20 gradations of engagement, when that's not how we live and think at all. And you could look at anything that goes on when you're talking about engagement. Well, a kid has some math anxiety. That doesn't mean that they're disengaged, but it does attenuate their engagement. You need some kind of more robust way of thinking about engagement than on-off or where you sit on 2 or 3 dimensions. And then we started looking at things coming out of like the Science of Learning Centers. The Science of Learning Center based at Temple University on spatialization, the work they'd done at Northwestern. Well, kids they recruit more activation patterns when mathematics can be expressed in a spatial mode. How do you talk about that in terms of engagement theory? Well, you can't say they're on or off. You say if you have these dimensions, you have a more saturated engagement. And so that gave rise to the idea that you could look at engagement along multiple dimensions. And it turned out, as we started looking at it, that all these dimensions activated different neural regions. So if you started looking at spatialization or sense of personal agency, I'm speaking too simplistically when I say that being creative activates distinct neural patterns, but in a large sense it does. So personal agency, a sense of creativity, the kinds of interactions, the brain processing when you're in a multimedia environment, or if you're asking me questions or you're helping me, there's a whole different set of activities going on in the brain. And if you start thinking about a saturation level and you start thinking about multiple distinct dimensions, you can imagine rethinking engagement in what I would call a gradient view, and you start looking at ensembles of engagement where you might have several of these dynamics at play, and they all contribute to different subtleties or nuances of engagement, and that's a heck of an interesting area. And then combining that, to get to my last 30 seconds, there's this whole emerging area in brain science on network modes, task positive and default mode networks. We're excited about what you can learn from functional imaging, but if you go into a functional imaging experiment, there's a period of time where before they turn the magnet on, or after they turn the magnet on, but before they give you the task, it turns out that there's a whole lot of interesting stuff that's going on in the brain before the button's pushed. And so when neuroscientists...
Anticipatory engagements.
Anticipatory, but also just plain being at a default rest. They were detecting all these interesting patterns, and when you were in that mode was antagonistic and reciprocal or seesaw with actually engaging in a task. And so that whole area of default mode and task positive has, I'm sure you're much more engaged in that than I've been, but starting to work with some researchers at Case Western who are parsing out functionalities that are associated with and demonstrating that these two modes are really the reciprocal and antagonistic. When one is active, the other is not. They're just two different evolutionarily produced modes of neural patterns, networks of networks. So the notion of this little abstract was to do something of a prospectus for thinking about engagement a little bit differently, and that's where our path is, looking at gradients or saturations from multiple variables, and looking at ensembles, synergies. What happens if you can invoke these in math? You don't think about creativity, you don't think about agency, you don't think about help seeking, you don't think about help giving. But what happens if you design for those different aspects to function together, and then finally to look at those in a developmental, so that the developmental path, you think about the instructional designers that create conditions for engagement, but wait, can you entice individuals to, and can you nourish the self-regulatory competencies that help individuals create their own conditions for learning? So you're going from sort of a passively induced engagement or passively produced by the designers, the grown-ups, to a place or path where you are creating your own environmental circumstances that lead to your own persistence, your own grit, your own tenacity in an area. And just being able to go down that path, I think, it is my personal vindication to see where these paths can lead for, this conversation we just had. Is engagement a worthy research area, or is it too something or another to pursue? And I think it's seeing what it can be has been followed this path and worth discussing.
All right.
Roy, I've got the Jedi Master watching. I don't.
I was just going to mention some new data that Byron Reeves reported 2 days ago at our conference, MediaX. Byron is a media psychologist and has been studying a group of 30 undergraduates with a technology that enables them. It's tricky for IRB, but to take a screen snapshot every several seconds throughout the entire day while they're also wearing Affectiva, galvanic skin response, heart rate, and they're creating new ways of analyzing the unbelievable individual difference that arise there, and developing tasks switching ontologies. What's going on, because you can literally watch starting a study task, flipping to Facebook to see if your friend uploaded a picture, watching a little YouTube video for a second, etc. And the studies that they've started doing on that, looking at arousal, there is an anticipatory arousal before the task switching by several seconds.
There's a lot going on during that anticipation.
Well, yeah, because you've been conditioned to believe that you will have some positive dopamine reward when you do. And they've looked at work to play switches and play to work switches. You can just imagine what those are like as you go out of play back into work. Boom, you're losing the engagement. Just to give you some new tools to think about.
So I don't know the format that we have, but I know that there was going to be a